I spent 30 years as a sound engineer, but the most important recording of my life is the one I locked away in a safe. In 1987, while visiting an illegal memorial I created for my late wife deep in the Oregon wilderness, I discovered that I wasn't grieving alone. What started as a melody played on a cassette tape became a duet with a creature that science says doesn't exist, a 23-hour testament to the fact that heartbreak is a universal language, shared even by the giants of the forest. Before we listen to the silence of the woods, let me know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. And if you're interested in more stories about the hidden side of Bigfoot, please subscribe to the channel. The silence of a house after a funeral isn't truly silent. It's a deafening roar of absence. My name is Malcolm Torres, and in 1987, I was a man living in the negative space left by my wife, Elena. At 51, I had retired early, not because I wanted to, but because the music had stopped making sense without her. I traded our bustling life in Portland for a small A-frame cabin deep in the Mount Hood National Forest, seeking a solitude that I hoped would numb the ache in my chest. I wasn't looking for adventure. I was looking for a place where the static in my head could finally match the quiet of the world around me. I spent 30 years as a sound engineer, tuning concert halls and mixing albums for bands that wanted to capture lightning in a bottle. My ears were my livelihood. I could hear a 60-cycle hum in a wall of guitar feedback. I could pinpoint a drummer dragging the tempo by milliseconds. This profession rewired my brain. I don't just see a room. I hear its geometry. I know how sound waves bounce off concrete versus velvet. So when I moved to the woods, I didn't see the trees as scenery. I heard them as a complex acoustic baffle, dampening the noise of civilization and creating a studio of pure organic sound. The wilderness became my new mixing board. I spent my days chopping wood and fixing the roof, but my mind was always analyzing the sonic landscape. The wind in the Douglas firs produced a specific white noise, a shh, that sat around 4 kHz. The raven's call was a sharp transient that cut through the mid-range. I found a strange comfort in this predictability. In the studio, I could control the faders. I could mute the bad takes. Out here, the mix was live and unyielding, but at least it was honest. There was no auto-tune in nature, only the raw, unpolished reality of survival. I brought my tools with me, unable to completely sever the tie to my past life. My prized possession was a Sony Walkman Pro WMD6C, a brick of a machine that recorded audio with the fidelity of a reel-to-reel. I carried it everywhere, strapped to my belt like a sidearm, along with a pair of Sennheiser headphones that hugged my ears like a second skin. I told myself I was recording ambient nature tracks, but in truth, I was terrified of forgetting the sounds of the world. Grief does that to you. It makes you a hoarder of sensory details, afraid that if you stop paying attention, everything will disappear. Elena had been a cellist. She understood the vibration of things. She used to say that the forest had its own key signature, a low resonant C natural that vibrated in the earth. I missed the sound of her practicing in the living room, the way the bough bit into the strings and made the air heavy with emotion. Now the cabin was filled only with the pop of the wood stove and the creak of settling timbers. I felt like a microphone left on in an empty room, picking up nothing but the noise floor of my own loneliness. I wasn't a survivalist or a mountain man. I was a city guy in flannel, learning the hard way how to keep the pipes from freezing. The locals in the nearest town, a dusty stopover called Rhododendron, viewed me with a mix of suspicion and pity. They saw a widower running away from his ghosts. They weren't wrong. I kept to myself, buying beans and batteries in bulk, avoiding eye contact. I didn't want their sympathy. I wanted the anonymity of the trees, where no one knew that half of me had been incinerated in a crematorium in November. My daily routine was rigid, a structure built to keep the depression at bay. Coffee at 6, wood chopping at 7, and then the hike. I walked miles every day, pushing my body until my legs burned, trying to exhaust the grief physically. I learned the trails better than the rangers. I knew which ridges had the best reverb and which valleys swallowed sound. I was mapping the acoustics of my exile, looking for the perfect spot to be alone, truly alone, where the only thing I had to listen to was the beating of my own reluctant heart. I found myself drawn to the deeper parts of the forest, the old-growth stands where the canopy was so thick it blocked out the sky. It was darker there, quieter. The moss grew inches thick, absorbing every footfall. In audio terms, it was a dead room. It was the perfect place to hide. I started venturing off-trail, navigating by the sound of the river and the slope of the land. I was looking for a sanctuary, a place that felt sacred enough to hold the weight of what I was carrying in my backpack. The isolation heightened my senses to a paranoid degree. When you live in silence, every snapped twig sounds like a gunshot. I started noticing patterns that a normal hiker would miss, the way the birds would suddenly go silent in a rolling wave, as if a fader was being pulled down. I heard heavy footsteps that didn't match the cadence of a deer or the shuffle of a bear. I told myself it was just the acoustics of the canyon playing tricks, the echo of my own boots returning to me with a delay. But the forest has a presence. Any engineer knows that even silence has a room tone, a specific pressure that tells you you're not in a vacuum. As the spring of 1987 melted the snowpack, that room tone changed. The air felt charged, heavy with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt watched, not in a predatory way, but in a curious way. It felt like someone was listening to me, just as intently as I was listening to the world. I adjusted my headphones, checked my recording levels, and kept walking, heading toward the secret place I had chosen for Elena. The act itself was a felony, or at least a serious federal misdemeanor, but grief makes you an outlaw. Elena had made me promise not to put her in a columbarium stacked in a wall like a library book. She wanted to be part of the hum of the world. So, in late November of '86, with her gray ashes heavy in a velvet bag, I hiked 5 miles off the Pacific Crest Trail to a ridge overlooking the Salmon River. It was federal land, protected wilderness where leaving anything behind, trash or human remains, was strictly prohibited. I didn't care. I scattered her into the wind and the ferns, turning the forest floor into a sacred, secret graveyard that no map would ever mark. I chose that specific spot not just for the view, but for the acoustics. It was a natural amphitheater, a granite bowl carved by glaciers that caught the wind and turned it into a low, resonant drone. Elena would have loved it. She used to say that the earth was the ultimate bass instrument. When I stood there, I felt like I was standing inside the body of a cello. I buried a small, waterproof box at the base of a massive hemlock tree to mark the center of the site, a private benchmark in a wilderness of millions of acres. This was my destination. This was where I went to clock in for my shift of mourning. The illegality of what I had done added a layer of paranoia to my grief. I was terrified that a ranger or a hiker would find the spot, realize what it was, and somehow evict her. I became an expert at counter-surveillance. I never took the same route twice. I stepped on rocks to avoid leaving footprints in the mud. I wore muted colors that blended into the understory. I was a ghost visiting a ghost, moving through the woods with a stealth that felt instinctive, driven by the desperate need to protect the only piece of her I had left. My ritual was rigid. On the 14th of every month, the anniversary of the day she died, I packed my rucksack. I brought a thermos of black coffee, a sandwich I wouldn't eat, and my audio equipment. The hike took 3 hours of grueling vertical climbing, a physical penance that I welcomed. The burning in my legs distracted me from the burning in my mind. By the time I reached the ridge, I was exhausted, sweaty, and stripped of my defenses. That was the point. You have to be empty before you can fill yourself with memory. When I arrived, I would sit on a flat rock facing the hemlock tree and set up my station. I placed the Sony Walkman Pro on the granite, connected a small battery-powered speaker, not loud enough to disturb the wildlife, but loud enough to create a bubble of sound around me. I treated the setup with the same reverence I used to have for a mixing desk at a stadium show. I checked the batteries. I cleaned the tape heads. This was the only concert that mattered now, a private performance for an audience of one dead woman and the indifferent trees. I always played the same tape. Elena performing Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. I had recorded it myself in our living room 3 years prior, capturing every breath she took between phrases, the slide of her fingers on the fretboard, the rosin biting the string. When I pressed play, she was alive again. The rich, woody timbre of her cello drifted through the thin mountain air, mixing with the sound of the wind. It was a surreal, heartbreaking mix, high art meeting wild nature. I would close my eyes and visualize her hands, letting the music reconstruction her body in the empty space before me. After the music, I talked. It started as a whisper, then grew into a conversation. I told her about the cabin, the leak in the roof, the book I was reading. It felt insane at first, talking to a hemlock tree, but I realized that sound waves don't care if they are heard, they just need to be released. I treated the air like a microphone. I gave her the mix of my life. "I miss you," I would say, testing the levels of my own voice. "It's too quiet without you. The frequency response of the house is all wrong." I didn't hold back the tears. In the city, you have to mourn politely. You have to keep it together in the grocery store. But up there, miles from the nearest road, I could let the faders up. I howled. I let the ugly, jagged sounds of grief rip out of my throat. I screamed until my voice cracked, the sound echoing off the granite walls and disappearing into the valley. It was a primal release, a sonic purging of the pressure that built up over the month. I wasn't an engineer then. I was just a wounded animal calling for a mate who wasn't coming back. The ritual became my religion. The hike, the setup, the music, the talk. It was the liturgy of my survival. I started to feel that the ridge was the only place where I was truly real. The rest of the month was just waiting. I felt a magnetic pull to that spot, a belief that she was somehow suspended there in the static of the woods, waiting for me to press play. I was keeping her alive with sound, sustaining her memory on a loop of magnetic tape. It was April 1987 when the acoustics of the ridge changed. I had just finished playing the prelude, the final note fading into the hiss of the tape. I was wiping my eyes, preparing to pack up, when I heard it. It wasn't an echo. An echo is a repetition, a decay. This was a response. From the dense timber below the ridge, a sound rose up, a low, mournful hum that matched the pitch of the cello perfectly. It held the note, vibrated with it, and then tapered off. I froze, my hand hovering over the Walkman. I knew sound, I knew physics, and I knew that trees don't hum in the key of G major. My first instinct was to debug the signal chain. As a sound engineer, you are trained to look for logical explanations, radio interference, tape bleed, or a loose connection in the headphone jack. I paused the Walkman, plunging the ridge back into the natural silence of the afternoon. The humming stopped instantly. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears against the wind. I pressed play again. Elena's cello swelled into the sarabande, a slow, melancholic progression. 3 seconds later, the sound returned, a low, resonant moaning that drifted up from the tree line, locking perfectly into the key of G major. I rewound the tape and played the section again, testing the variable. If it was an animal, a bear or a cougar, it would be random. It would be noise, not music. But the response was precise. When the cello dipped to the low D, the voice dropped with it, maintaining a perfect harmonic interval. It was harmonizing. My skin prickled with a cold sweat. Nature doesn't harmonize with Bach. Birds sing in patterns, yes, but they don't counterpoint 18th century classical music. I was listening to a biological entity that possessed pitch perfection and a sense of relative musicality. I analyzed the timbre of the voice through my Sennheiser headphones, isolating it from the wind. It was organic, definitely a vocal tract, but the resonance was impossible for a human. It had a chestiness, a depth in the 100 Hz range, that suggested a chest cavity twice the size of a man's. It sounded like a double bass made of flesh and bone. The texture was gravelly but controlled, lacking the aggression of a growl. It was soft, almost tentative, like someone humming along to a song they half remembered from a dream. I decided to run a call and response test. I stopped the tape abruptly in the middle of a phrase. The voice from the woods held the note for a second longer, resolving the melody, and then trailed off into silence. It was listening. It was anticipating the music. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with an intelligent awareness. I wasn't alone on the ridge. Someone or something was sitting in the gallery of the forest, attending my private concert. Fear should have been my primary emotion. I was unarmed, miles from civilization, with a massive creature lurking 50 yards away. But my curiosity overrode my survival instinct. The engineer in me took over. I unclipped the microphone from my belt and held it out, turning the input gain up to the maximum. I needed to capture this. I needed to see the waveform. I pressed record on the Walkman, sacrificing the playback of Elena to catch the ghost in the machine. I sang. My voice was rusty, thin compared to the cello, but I sang the first few bars of Amazing Grace. I waited. From the shadows of the old-growth firs, the voice answered. It didn't mimic the words, but it mimicked the melody, sliding up to the notes with a mournful, sliding portamento. It was a bluesy, soulful interpretation of my erratic singing. The creature was correcting my pitch. It was jamming with me. The realization was dizzying. I was in a duet with the wilderness. The emotional quality of the vocalization was what shook me the most. It wasn't a territorial call. It wasn't a mating cry. It was saturated with sorrow. In audio production, we talk about the color of a sound. This sound was dark blue, heavy, and weeping. The creature sounded exactly the way I felt. It was mirroring the grief of the music, projecting a sense of loss that felt ancient and profound. It was as if the music had unlocked a door in the woods, and something hurt was stepping through. I spent an hour testing the limits of this interaction. I whistled. It whistled back, though an octave lower. I hummed a major scale. It hummed it back, but flattened the 7th note, turning it into a mixolydian mode. This wasn't just mimicry. It was variation. It was improvisation. The creature had a musical vocabulary. I sat on my rock, the tears drying on my face, completely entranced by the invisible baritone hidden in the ferns. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the ridge. The temperature dropped, and the acoustics shifted as the air cooled. The voice stopped responding, fading back into the ambient noise of the river. I packed my gear with trembling hands, checking the tape to make sure it had actually recorded. It had. The needles had jumped. The evidence was there on the magnetic strip. I wasn't crazy. I hiked back down the mountain in a daze, my headlamps cutting a cone through the darkness. I didn't feel the usual crushing weight of leaving Elena behind. For the first time in 6 months, the silence didn't feel empty. I knew I had to go back. Not just to mourn, but to meet the other mourner. I needed to see the face of the thing that could sing a harmony to a dead woman's cello. Summer arrived in the Cascades with a riot of wildflowers, painting the ridges in purple lupine and red paintbrush. By June 1987, my monthly pilgrimage had transformed from a solitary act of penance into a surreal appointment with the unknown. I arrived at the memorial site just before noon, the sun high and bright, washing out the shadows that usually hid the forest's secrets. I set up my equipment with trembling hands, the Walkman, the speaker, the microphone. The air pressure felt low, heavy, the acoustic sign of a storm coming, or perhaps simply the density of another presence arriving to fill the space. She stepped out from behind a massive cedar tree at 12:15 p.m., moving with a slowness that immediately quelled my panic. This was not the aggressive monster of folklore crashing through the brush. This was an elderly female Bigfoot, a matriarch in the winter of her life. She stood perhaps 7 feet tall, but her posture was stooped, her spine curved by the gravity of decades. Her fur was a patchwork of dark brown and extensive silver gray, particularly around her muzzle and shoulders, giving her the appearance of wearing a heavy woolen shawl. She looked ancient, weary, and impossibly human in her frailty. I sat frozen on my rock, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She didn't look at me directly. Her gaze was soft, unfocused, directed toward the hemlock tree where Elena's ashes lay. She knew what that tree was. She knew it was a marker. She limped slightly, favoring her left hip, a movement I recognized from my own aching joints. It was a moment of jarring biological recognition. Arthritis is universal. The creature was suffering from the same decay of the flesh that haunts us all. She was just an old woman, tired and hurting, coming to a quiet place to rest. She settled onto a mossy log about 40 feet away, keeping a respectful distance. She adjusted her position carefully, wincing as she bent her knees, and let out a long, shuddering sigh that I felt in the soles of my feet. It was the heavy exhale of someone putting down a physical burden. She folded her large, leathery hands in her lap, sitting with a quiet dignity that commanded the clearing. We were 2 mourners in a natural cathedral, sitting in the pews, waiting for the service to begin. The truce was unspoken but absolute. This was neutral ground, sanctified by grief. I pressed play on the Walkman. The opening notes of the cello suite floated across the clearing. The elderly Bigfoot closed her eyes and tipped her head back, exposing the silver throat. She didn't react with surprise, she reacted with relief. She began to sway, a subtle, rhythmic rocking that matched the tempo of the sarabande. It was a self-soothing behavior, the kind you see in nursing homes and nurseries. She was drinking in the sound, letting the vibrations massage the ache in her bones. To her, the cello wasn't just music, it was medicine. Then, she joined in. I watched, mesmerized, as her massive chest expanded, her diaphragm dropping to support the column of air. She didn't open her mouth wide. She kept her lips barely parted, creating a resonant chamber within her oral cavity. The sound that emerged was a low, mournful croon, a vowel sound somewhere between O and It was perfectly pitched to the root note of the chord. Seeing the mechanics of the vocalization, the control of the breath, the modulation of the larynx, confirmed what my ears had suspected. This was a practiced skill. She was a singer. The realization hit me that she wasn't just reacting to my ritual. She was bringing her own. The way she sat, the specific vocalizations she used, the timing of her arrival. It was all ceremonial. She was mourning something too. Perhaps a mate, perhaps a child, perhaps just the fading of her own strength. We were a pair of widows, separated by millions of years of evolution, but united by the universal language of loss. I looked at her gray face, the deep lines etched around her eyes, and I didn't see a beast. I saw a mirror. As the months passed into late summer, her appearance became the anchor of my visits. I stopped bringing the bear spray. I stopped scanning the perimeter for threats. I simply set up the stage and waited for my co-star. She was punctual, usually arriving within minutes of the music starting. She seemed to understand the technology, or at least its function. She would watch the reels of the cassette tape spin, her head cocked, tracking the movement. To her, the black box was the source of the spirit voice, the singing wood that we both came to worship. The dynamic between us was delicate, balanced on a razor's edge of silence. We never made direct eye contact for more than a second. That was a primate challenge I knew to avoid. Instead, we communicated through the triangulation of the music. I looked at the tree. She looked at the tree. We poured our emotions into that central point. Sometimes when the music ended, she would make a soft, chuffing sound, a conversational murmur directed at the ground. I would murmur back. It was a dialogue of tone, devoid of syntax but full of meaning. By August, the days began to shorten, and the light in the clearing changed to a deep, golden amber. The elderly Bigfoot seemed to move slower with each visit, her breathing becoming more labored. I could hear the rattle in her chest from 30 feet away, the fluid of age, the slow failure of the lungs. I knew sound, and I knew the sound of a system winding down. I felt a desperate urgency to capture this, to document the song of a dying species before the winter silence took her back. I needed better microphones. I needed to capture the nuance. By September, I treated the ridge not as a memorial site, but as a remote recording studio. I retired the internal microphone of the Walkman and upgraded to my Sennheiser MKH416, a shotgun mic wrapped in a dead cat windshield to kill the noise of the breeze. I ran XLR cables through the ferns, camouflaging them with moss, creating a capture zone that would pick up a pin drop at 50 yards. I wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. I was an audio engineer tasked with capturing the most elusive vocal performance on Earth. The stakes were absolute. I had to get a clean signal to prove that the song of the forest wasn't just wind in the trees. The elderly Bigfoot seemed to respect the upgrade in technology. She watched me set up the boom stand with a curious, tilted head, her dark eyes tracking the silver tube of the microphone. She didn't flinch when I pointed it at her. In the studio, we call this mic discipline, the talent knowing how to work the equipment. She understood that the object was an ear. When she settled onto her log, she projected her voice directly toward the capsule, adjusting her volume to match the ambient noise floor of the afternoon. She was a professional, instinctively understanding the physics of sound projection in a damp environment. I hit record, and the tape began to spin, capturing the audio with crystalline fidelity. Through the headphones, the sound was intimate, terrifyingly close. I could hear the wet click of her tongue against her palate, the intake of breath through her wide nostrils, the subtle wheeze deep in her bronchial tubes. When the Bigfoot began to vocalize, the meters on the Walkman danced into the red. I rode the gain knob, pulling it back to prevent distortion, sweating as I tried to mix a live performance of an unknown species. The recording captured the rich, complex overtones of her voice, frequencies that vibrated in the sub-bass range that human ears can feel but barely hear. Back at the cabin, under the glow of a kerosene lamp, I turned my dining table into a post-production suite. I played the tapes back on loop, analyzing the audio with the critical ear of a producer. What I heard shattered the animal hypothesis completely. Animals make sounds to signal immediate needs: danger, food, mating. But the creature's vocalizations contained distinct phrasing. She would sing a melodic line, pause for a breath, and then repeat the line with a slight variation in pitch. This is the definition of a musical motif. She wasn't just making noise, she was composing. I sketched out the melodies on staff paper, mapping the intervals. The Bigfoot favored a pentatonic scale, common in many ancient human musical traditions, but she often flattened the third, creating a blue note that gave the music its sorrowful character. Her intonation was deliberate. She didn't slide around searching for the pitch. She hit it dead on. When she harmonized with the cello on the tape, she was consistently singing a perfect fifth below the melody. This requires a sophisticated understanding of relative pitch. A wolf might howl, but a wolf doesn't understand counterpoint. The recordings revealed a structural complexity that suggested a cultural tradition. There were recurring themes in her songs, specific melodic shapes that appeared in June, July, and August. It implied that these weren't improvised outbursts, but memorized pieces. Was she singing a liturgy, a lullaby, a history? The creature was accessing a library of songs stored in her mind, repeating them with the reverence of a priest reciting a psalm. The precision of the repetition proved that this was a learned behavior, passed down through generations of oral tradition. I analyzed the attack and decay of her notes. She used dynamics to convey emotion, starting a phrase soft, piano, and swelling to loud, forte, before tapering off again. This is what we call expression in the music world. It's the difference between a synthesizer playing a note and a human playing a violin. The Bigfoot was making artistic choices. She was manipulating the volume and timbre of her voice to tell a story of tension and release. The tape didn't just capture sound, it captured the intentional manipulation of feeling. The more I listened, the more I recognized the techniques of a seasoned vocalist. I heard her use vibrato, a rapid, rhythmic oscillation of pitch, to sustain long notes. Vibrato is a motor skill. You have to learn how to relax the larynx to do it. The fact that an ape in the woods was using a controlled vibrato to beautify a melody was scientifically impossible. Yet there it was on the magnetic tape. She was using her anatomy as an instrument, playing her own throat with the dexterity of a virtuoso. I labeled the cassettes by date and mood. The Gray Song, the Rain Dirge, the Harmony in G. I had archivist's gold in my backpack, hours of evidence that the creature possessed an aesthetic sense. She understood beauty. She understood the catharsis of a sad song. We tend to think of art as the dividing line between man and beast, the spark of the divine that belongs only to us. But sitting in my cabin, listening to the ghostly, resonant croon of the Bigfoot, I knew that line had been erased. Art existed in the woods long before we dragged our pianos into them. The realization shifted my role from observer to collaborator. If she understood music, if she understood structure and harmony, then she wasn't just a passive listener to my tapes. She was a musician waiting for a jam session. I looked at my shelf of cassettes, jazz, blues, opera, rock. I wondered how her sophisticated ear would process different genres. I wasn't just recording a specimen anymore. I was communicating with a colleague. I decided that next month, I wouldn't just play Bach. I would expand the playlist. I needed to see if the creature could swing. October brought the heavy rains, the kind that turned the Oregon earth into a sponge and dampened the acoustics of the world. I hiked up to the ridge with a waterproof bag full of cassettes, ready to conduct the most surreal focus group in history. I treated the playlist like a scientific control group. If she responded to Bach, how would she handle the dissonance of jazz or the raw ache of the Delta blues? I wasn't just entertaining a cryptid, I was testing the universality of human musical theory on a non-human mind. I set up the speakers under a tarp, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the plastic, and waited for my audience of one. She arrived with the rain, her fur matted and dark, smelling of wet dog and cedar. She sat on her log, shivering slightly, looking at the black box of the speaker with expectation. I started safely with Mozart's Requiem. The effect was immediate. As the choral voices swelled, the tension left her shoulders. She recognized the structure, the clean mathematical resolution of classical chords. She didn't sing along this time. She just swayed, her eyes half closed, letting the complex harmonies wash over her. It was a sedative. To her, classical music was a lullaby, a sound of order in a chaotic wilderness. Then I switched the tape to Blind Willie Johnson. Dark was the night, cold was the ground. The slide guitar whined, a sound of pure distilled suffering. The elderly Bigfoot sat up straighter, her ears twitching. The slide guitar mimics the human voice, crying and moaning, and she recognized the timbre of pain instantly. She began to vocalize, a low, guttural moan that slid between the notes. She wasn't harmonizing in the traditional sense. She was testifying. She understood the blues intuitively. It wasn't about the notes. It was about the space between them, the blue notes of sorrow that exist in every species. The interaction during the blues track was profound. When Johnson hummed, she hummed back, matching his vibrato with a terrifying precision. It was a duet across time and species, a blind man from the 1920s and a Bigfoot from the 1980s, united by the frequency of grief. She added a sub-bass rumble to the mix that rattled my ribcage. It was the deepest, saddest sound I had ever heard. She wasn't just listening to the song, she was claiming it. She was telling me that she knew what it meant to be cold, to be dark, to be alone on the ground. I decided to push the envelope. I loaded a Miles Davis tape, Kind of Blue. Jazz is different. It's about tension, improvisation, and breaking the rules. When the trumpet cut through the rain, sharp and melancholic, the creature looked confused. She tilted her head, trying to find the one, the downbeat. But as the band swung into the groove, she found it. She started tapping her large foot against the log. Thump, 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 locking into the rhythm section. She understood syncopation. She understood that the beat was elastic. The vocalization she offered for jazz was radically different. It wasn't a moan. It was a series of short, percussive grunts and chirps that danced around the trumpet line. She was scatting in her own language, filling the gaps in the melody with rhythmic percussion. It was playful. For the first time, I saw a spark of something other than sadness in her eyes. She was curious. She was engaged. She was intellectually stimulated by the complexity of the improvisation. We weren't mourning anymore. We were thinking. I grabbed the microphone and decided to join the session. I couldn't play an instrument, so I hummed a simple bass line, leaving space for her to fill. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the sonic pocket I created, adding a high-pitched whistle melody over my low hum. We were improvising a composition in real time. I would go up. She would go down. I would get loud. She would get soft. It was a conversation without words, a negotiation of frequencies. I felt a rush of adrenaline that I hadn't felt since I was mixing live shows. I was jamming with a legend. The connection was electric. In that hour, the rain didn't matter. The cold didn't matter. We were two musicians locked in a groove. I realized that music is not a human invention. It is a discovery of the physics of the universe, and she was just as plugged into it as I was. She anticipated my changes. If I held a note too long, she would nudge me with a sharp intake of breath, urging the phrase forward. She had a sense of timing that was impeccable. She was a better listener than half the musicians I had recorded in Portland. As the tape ran out, clicking off with a loud snap, the silence returned, heavier than before. The spell broke. The elderly Bigfoot slumped back against the tree, the energy draining from her. The music had been a temporary bridge, a way to transcend the physical limitations of our bodies and our species. She looked at me, and I saw the exhaustion of the performance in her face. We had shared something intimate, a vulnerability that only musicians understand after a show. We had exposed our souls to the air. I packed up my gear, treating the tapes like holy relics. I had captured a blues jam with a cryptid. I had proof that the monster had a soul capable of appreciating Miles Davis. But more than that, I had proof that she was lonely. The music hadn't just entertained her, it had given her a way to speak. As I walked away, I heard a soft trailing whistle from the darkness, a snippet of the jazz melody we had just shared. It was her encore. She was practicing. November marked the first anniversary of Elena's death, a date that hung over me like a guillotine. The forest was stripped bare, the deciduous trees standing like gray skeletons against a steel wool sky. I hiked to the ridge not to experiment, but to survive the day. When I arrived, the elderly Bigfoot was already there. This was a deviation from her pattern. Usually she waited for the music to summon her. But today, she was standing by the hemlock tree. My tree, Elena's marker. Running her long, dark fingers over the rough bark. She wasn't investigating a scent. She was caressing the wood with the tenderness of a mother touching a child's hair. I froze, realizing I had intruded on a private moment. She didn't acknowledge me. She leaned her forehead against the trunk, closing her eyes, and let out a sound that I didn't need a microphone to understand. It was a keen, a high, thinning wail that started in the throat and ended in the air like smoke. It was the universal frequency of heartbreak. In that moment, the scientific detachment I had cultivated shattered. I wasn't looking at a cryptid. I was looking at a widow. She knew what lay beneath the roots of that tree. She sensed the death in the soil, and it resonated with the death she carried in her own heart. I set up my equipment in silence, feeling like an intruder in my own sanctuary. I realized then that our monthly appointments weren't just about the music I played, they were about the date. She had a calendar in her mind, a cycle of return driven by memory. Just as I returned to the ridge to feel close to Elena, she returned to this ridge, perhaps to this very spot, to mourn her own loss. The geography of the ridge was a shared graveyard. We were two pilgrims visiting the same shrine, worshiping different ghosts in the same holy space. I didn't play Bach that day. It felt too structured, too cerebral. I played a recording of silence, just the ambient room tone of the empty house after Elena died. It was a conceptual tape I had made in a moment of despair. The Bigfoot sat on her log, listening to the hiss of the empty tape. She understood the context. She began to rock back and forth, a metronome of grief, and added a low rhythmic hum to the silence. It was a funeral song. She was filling the empty space I had brought her with a litany of her own sorrow. The realization of her emotional depth was staggering. Grief is a sophisticated cognitive process. It requires a concept of the past, a recognition of the permanence of absence, and the ability to value an individual life above others. Biology dictates that animals move on to survive. They don't linger at grave sites for years. But she was lingering. She was wasting calories and energy to visit a place that offered no food, only memory. This proved she possessed a soul, or whatever we choose to call the seed of love that persists after the object of love is gone. We sat there for hours as the light faded, united by the heavy, wet blanket of depression. I looked at her, the gray in her muzzle, the stiffness in her joints, and I saw my own future. We were the leftovers, the ones who had been left behind to turn off the lights. I felt a profound kinship with this massive, hairy being. The differences in our species, the language, the culture, the genetics, were trivial compared to the monolithic similarity of our pain. We were members of the same club, the one no one wants to join. She seemingly had a specific ritual of her own. After the humming stopped, she stood up and walked to a small pile of stones near the edge of the cliff, a cairn I had noticed but dismissed as natural rockfall. She picked up a smooth river stone from the ground, breathed on it, a transfer of warmth, of spirit, and placed it gently on top of the pile. It was a deliberate, ceremonial act. She was building a monument. That pile of rocks wasn't random debris. It was her altar. She was tending to her dead, just as I was tending to mine. I recorded the sound of the stone clicking into place. It was a sharp, percussive transient that cut through the wind. On the tape, it sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. That click was the undeniable proof of ritual behavior. Anthropologists argue that burial rites are the dawn of civilization. Here in the Oregon wilderness, a non-human being was practicing a rite of remembrance. She was civilized. She had a culture of one, keeping the flame alive for someone who had vanished into the mist years ago. The music we made that day was the most difficult I ever recorded. It wasn't a jam session, it was a dual eulogy. I sang a broken version of Elena's favorite folk song, my voice cracking under the weight of the anniversary. The Bigfoot harmonized with a series of descending minor thirds, the musical interval of sadness. We weren't performing for each other anymore. We were holding each other up. Her voice wrapped around mine like a bandage, a deep, resonant support that kept me from falling apart completely. As she left that evening, disappearing into the dark timber, she stopped and looked back at me. It was the first time she held my gaze for more than a fleeting second. Her eyes were dark pools of ancient, exhausted intelligence. There was no fear, no curiosity, only a somber recognition. She nodded, a slight singular dip of the chin. It was an acknowledgement. I see you. I know why you are here. I am here for the same reason. We were accomplices in the crime of not forgetting. By the winter of 1988, my dining room table groaned under the weight of the evidence. I had filled 23 90-minute Maxell cassettes, a magnetic library labeled simply the Ridge Sessions. As a sound engineer, I knew the technical value of what I possessed. It was the cleanest, most comprehensive field recording of an unknown hominid in existence. I had captured not just vocalizations, but a lexicon. I had the rain dirge, the stone stacking rhythms, and the blues for the hemlock. I had 23 hours of undeniable proof that the Bigfoot was not a monster, but a person with a culture as rich and sorrowful as our own. I spent weeks digitizing the analog tapes, watching the waveforms dance on my oscilloscope. The visual representation of her voice was hypnotic, complex fractals of sound that no human throat could produce. I saw the morning signature, a specific dip in frequency that appeared every time she was near the memorial tree. This was the smoking gun for anthropology. It proved abstract thought, ritual behavior, and emotional bonding. If I mailed these tapes to a university, I would be the most famous man in the world. I would rewrite the history of biology overnight. The Nobel Prize wasn't out of the question. But every time I reached for the phone to call a contact at the university, I looked at the map pinned to my wall. The audio didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in a specific location. To validate the recordings, I would have to reveal the source. I would have to lead the scientists, the journalists, and the inevitable hunters to the ridge. I would have to point to the coordinates where the magic happened. And those coordinates were the exact location of Elena's illegal grave. The sanctuary where my wife slept was the stage where the creature sang. You couldn't have one without the other. The legal reality was a cold bucket of water. I had disposed of human remains on federal land. If the authorities found out, it wouldn't just be a fine. They would view it as contamination. They would bring shovels. They would dig up the soil around the hemlock tree to remediate the site. The thought of strangers sifting through the dirt that held Elena's ashes, bagging her up like evidence or hazardous waste, made me physically ill. I would be desecrating her memory to satisfy the world's curiosity. I would be trading her peace for my fame. Then there was the cost to the creature. I imagined the ridge after the announcement. It wouldn't be a quiet cathedral anymore. It would be a circus. Helicopters would buzz the tree line. Weekend warriors with rifles and cameras would trample the moss. The silence that the elderly Bigfoot needed to survive, the silence that allowed her to mourn, would be shattered by the roar of generators and the shout of discovery. She would be driven out, or worse, cornered. I had recorded her song because she trusted me to be a silent witness. Publishing it would be the ultimate betrayal of that trust. I realized that the truth is a commodity that often destroys the thing it seeks to understand. Science demands dissection. It wants to pin the butterfly to the board. But the beauty of the Bigfoot song was that it was wild, uncaptured, and free. If I gave her to the world, I killed the very thing that made her human. She wasn't a data point. She was a widow. She deserved the dignity of her grief, not the flashbulbs of the paparazzi. Protecting her privacy was the only way to honor the bond we had formed in the rain. I looked at the stacks of cassettes, the master tapes of a species. They were heavy with responsibility. I thought about Elena. She was a musician. She played for the beauty of the moment, not for the applause. She would have understood. She would have hated the idea of her resting place becoming a tourist attraction. She would have wanted the music to remain a secret duet between the trees and the wind. By keeping the tapes hidden, I wasn't burying the truth. I was protecting the sanctity of the grave. The decision was made in the quiet of a Tuesday morning. I took the 23 tapes and placed them in a waterproof, fireproof Pelican case. I didn't burn them. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the art we had made, but I sealed them with a padlock. I wasn't the discoverer of Bigfoot anymore. I was the keeper of the vault. The world could keep its mysteries. The scientists could keep looking for footprints. I had the song, and that was enough. I knew what was out there, and I knew that it had a heart that beat in time with mine. I returned to the ridge one last time that winter, without the microphone, without the recorder. I just brought the cello tape and a fresh battery. The elderly Bigfoot was there, waiting. We sat in the snow, listening to Bach, two old souls warming ourselves by the fire of memory. I looked at her, and I knew she understood. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was a pact. We were the guardians of the ridge, the secret keepers of the Salmon River. I walked down the mountain as the sun set, leaving the creature to her vigil. I am an old man now, and the tapes are still in the box, gathering dust in the attic. I listen to them sometimes, late at night, when the house is too quiet. I hear her voice harmonizing with Elena's cello, a ghost singing with a ghost, and I weep not for what the world is missing, but for the beauty of what I was allowed to keep. The evidence is irrefutable, but the love that required its silence is the only truth that matters.